Before we get started, I just wanted to get a quick sense of the room's experience in a few of these technologies that we're going to be talking about today. Just by a show of hands, I'm sure most of you probably have, because I know a lot of you are actually current students or residents here at Learning Fuse, but just a quick show of hands, who here has any experience in developing in React? Okay, cool, so a good amount. How about Redux? Who has some experience in Redux? Well, the exact same amount of people, interesting. Awesome, okay, that's good. How about, let's see how many hands come up on this one. Who's here has ever actually used the context API alone by itself in an application? That's exactly what I'd like to see. Cool, so then nobody can call me out on anything that I say wrong tonight. Perfect. I like being the most experienced one in the room. So undoubtedly, you guys are all here to learn a little bit more about the context API, this mysterious, new, buzzing technology that's kind of come out really big over the last 6 months to a year or so. And undoubtedly, to kind of answer this question, right? Is it a replacement for Redux? Can it be a replacement for Redux? Are the rumors true? Did it come out, and is it really going to be the Redux killer that everybody talked about before it actually came out? So my goal before the end of tonight, over the next 45 minutes or so, is to give you guys that knowledge to answer that question yourself. Is the context API the Redux killer that everybody talked about? And also the tools necessary for you to implement the context API, any of your future projects, in figuring out really when it's important or when it's applicable to add it into your applications. So before we get into the actual presentation, a little bit about me. This is always like the most awkward part of any presentation that I give, is talking about myself, so we're going to do it really quickly. Like VJ said, my name is Phillip Troutman. I'm a full-stack JavaScript developer, usually working out of LA, but the startup that I currently work for is also working out of New York, called CS Labs. We build an online platform for JavaScript engineers to learn more, whether you're an intermediate or complete beginner to JavaScript, just upping your skills as a JavaScript developer. In the meantime, aside from just regular work, a lot of my open source projects or open source time has been contributed to this React Context API developer tool for Google Chrome. And I promise I don't want to make this sound pitchy or anything like that. I'm not trying to get GitHub stars from anybody or anything weird. I just throw that out there in case anybody has any questions on it. I know a lot of the seniors in the program right now are going through like your production project phases, or juniors moving into your senior portion of the projects. If you guys have any ideas or want to bounce any ideas off me, I'm all ears after we're finished. So what are we actually going to be talking about over the next 45 minutes to an hour? I've broken it down into 4 main categories of what we're going to discuss. First, we're going to talk about the origin of the context API. You know, where did it come from? When did it come out? A lot of you may be surprised to hear that the context API is nothing new. It's actually been around for quite a while now, just not really in its current form. So we're going to talk a little bit about where it came from and how long it's been around. And then we're going to transition over to where's the context API now? How has it evolved, and how has it transitioned from that starting point to what it looks like now in our applications? And then we're going to move into like the real like meat and potatoes of the talk. Does anybody use that term, meat and potatoes? I always feel like there's somebody that snickers and laughs at that. You use it in the back? What's your name? Cody, you're my favorite person right now in the room. Meat and potatoes. All right, so we're going to get into the meat and potatoes. Now I'm saying it too often, huh? It doesn't mean much anymore. We're going to get into the meat and potatoes of the talk when we talk about the implementation patterns of the context API and how we can actually implement it into our projects. And then finally, we'll dig into that burning question that everybody has, and I'm sure it's exactly why all of you are here, which is, can we replace Redux with the context API? Is it possible? And if so, how do we actually do it? So let's go ahead and get right into it. The origin of the context API. For those of you that are familiar with React, this may be kind of second nature, but for those of you that are not extremely experienced with React, maybe you don't know. But the context API is simply a React API. It's part of the React library, which means that if you've ever implemented or imported the React library into any of your programs over the last however many years, you've actually had access to the context API. With just a few lines of code, you could have had the context API running in your application. It's been around since 2013. Like I said before, it's nothing new. There's been a lot of buzz about it recently, and we'll talk about why that is. But the context API has been around ever since React was open source back in 2013. And for anybody who's known this stuff and still kind of avoided it and kind of went with Redux because it was the standard, and maybe you're like, oh, well, I know Redux already. You know, it's not broken. Why fix it? I don't want to learn something new. It sounds really complex and hard. The context API is really, really simple, actually. In fact, it's only designed to do one thing. Since it's been created and it's been part of the React library, it's been designed to do just one thing. And that one thing is to alleviate prop drilling. Who knows what prop drilling is? Who can give me like it doesn't have to be like the Webster's dictionary version of it, just in your own words, somebody explain for me, what is prop drilling? Cody, you want to, since you're my favorite person right now?
Sounds good.
Yeah, hit me with prop drilling.
It's where you have to continue to pass props and methods down from function to function, deeper and deeper into your components so that you can communicate across adjacent components.
Exactly. Yeah, hit it right on the head. To kind of give a, did you just give me the? Did you give me finger guns? Dude, you're pulling out ahead as my favorite person, because those are like my two favorite things: is finger guns and meat and potatoes. I couldn't have planted a better person in the audience right now. No, but absolutely, Cody, you're absolutely right. It's that process of passing data down throughout your application, throughout your React application through different components. And to kind of give us a visual representation for anybody who's not extremely familiar with using React without Redux or any other type of state management libraries, it would be something kind of like this. As a general outline, you know, we have our basic React application. We usually have our data or our state stored at one of the higher level components in the app. And if we had our children components way down here at the bottom that relied on that data up at the top, we would have to do this thing called prop drilling, where we would have to write code that would take that data from way up there at the top and pass it down every single level until we got down to our children components. So we would write the logic to pull the data from our state into this component via props. Then we would go into these components and we'd write the logic to pull this data down via props from there. And then we'd write the logic to pull them down into the children components. And then we'd have to write the logic to actually use that data that's stored inside the props. And just explaining that, it is a pain in the ass. It makes me tired just thinking about it, right? So this idea of the context API is to take this super complex prop drilling and unnecessary passing of data through these components that don't even need the data. So essentially, we're just convoluting these components now, making our code heavier because we have more code to compile, making our code harder to read, which is in turn making it less maintainable. We're taking all this data and passing it down. The context API says, nah, forget that. We're going to take that data and we're going to just pass it directly into whatever components actually need it without having to pass all these things down. It allows us to be able to inject that data at any level in our React API or in our React application at any point in time. And again, this is just a couple levels deep. Imagine how big of a pain in the ass that is if you have 50 components or 100 components or 100,000, whatever it may be. It gets to be very cumbersome very quickly. So this is what the React, or rather the context API, was designed to do. But there's one big problem with the context API at this point. The context API sucks. It's terrible. And some of you guys, I can see your faces already, you're like, well, wait, this talk just took a really weird turn. The context API really, and don't just take my word for it, if you really dig into the React docs, you'll find these warnings everywhere. Context is an advanced experimental feature. Don't use context just to avoid passing props. There's an actual article that says why not to use context. And then my favorite is, just as global variables are best avoided when writing clear code, you should avoid using context in most cases. This is the React library that's bashing its own API. So it doesn't necessarily instill a whole lot of confidence in this API, right? So again, this is 2013 when the context API and React first became open source. Now, fast forward, well, rather, just again, to demonstrate what I mean by this is, we had that context that was that idea of the context API that can inject data at any level that now is kind of rendered moot, right? We can't really use it in its current form. So in enters our pal Redux in 2015. Now, Redux came in as this state management library titan for React. It quickly became one of the most popular React libraries for state management. And essentially what it did is it took that context API, that broken, beat up context API that React just kept talking crap about, and it filled all those holes. It smoothed off those edges and allowed developers to actually use it via Redux. A lot of people that are experienced in Redux don't really understand that under the hood, Redux just uses the context API. Now, of course, it comes with a slew of other features in Redux for state management, but on the whole, that's the big benefit of using Redux, arguably, is the fact that you can pass props and pass state and methods and things like that from a centralized store for your application at any point in your React application. So, where we had this failed attempt at the context API, Redux came in, used the context API, and made it possible to pass data down throughout our entire application. So now at this point, most people are asking why. Okay, so why are we having this discussion? Why are we having this debate about whether or not the context API is going to be the Redux killer? Because realistically, it kind of seems like it was the other way around when it first came out, right? It seemed like Redux kind of came along and killed the context API and replaced that. So why are we having this discussion? Why is there so much debate online right now on Medium or on Reddit or whatever it is, or Discord channels or Slack channels about which one is better to use? Well, the answer to all those whys comes in the form of React 16.3. React 16.3 came out in March of this year. And with that came this very exciting thing. The very first pull request, the very first merge request for this new version of context, rather, this new version of React was new version of context. It was this completely revamped version of the context API, which allowed us to actually do what the context API set out for us to do in the first place. It allowed us to actually take that data from the top level component with no outside libraries, no Redux, no MobX, no anything else, and actually just use React to pass that data down with nothing else. So that kind of takes us through like our first foundational steps for the context API. It takes us through how it started and how it was kind of a failed attempt. And then Redux came along and kind of put it on its shoulders and allowed it to work. And then Context came back and said, you know, I don't need you, and came out with a new version, and now we have this workable version of the Context API. So now we have these two battling kind of technologies for state management in React. So now let's move into my favorite part. Cody, what's my favorite part? Which is what I always refer to as the meat and potatoes. Thanks, Cody. Yeah, that's the one. You just dropped down a level, man. Now the only thing that's holding you up top is the finger guns. You got to step it up. So now we're going to talk about the implementation patterns. Now we have that general foundation of knowledge for the Context API and Redux, so on and so forth. Now we want to know, how do we make this work now in our applications? How can we use this to improve and make our applications more efficient and clean and more manageable? Which brings us into implementation patterns. Now, one of the most powerful things about the Context API is that it's so damn flexible on implementation. You can do it in so many different ways. There's so many different techniques to implement the API into your application. We're going to go over 4 of them, realistically. We're going to go over this basic implementation. So using these things called provider consumers. In a very basic implementation, how we pass data from one area of our application all the way down through all these middlemen components over them without prop drilling, and how we access that data further down in our app. Then we're going to talk about this thing called the default value in the Context API and how we can use this to make our application even more dynamic. Then we're going to talk about this really cool thing, this technique using 2 providers in one component. And don't worry, I'm going to talk more in depth about what providers are and what consumers are and things like that. But use 2 providers inside one component, essentially taking data from 2 different parts of our application, 2 different context instances, and using that data inside one component in an effective way. And then finally, we're going to take on together as a team, we're going to figure out whether or not we can actually create this thing called a central store for our application. And for all of our Redux users in the room, this will become very familiar to you because that's essentially what Redux is all about. It's about using this idea of gathering all of our application state and all the methods and functions that can change that state into one location and making all of that stuff available to you at any point in our application. We're going to see if we can do that with just the Context API. But before we can do any of that, we need to talk about the fundamentals of the Context API. So remember I said that the API is kind of simple. I mean, it really only has like one goal, right? Is to alleviate prop drilling. Well, it's also really simple because it really only comes in 3 pieces. And if you can understand these 3 pieces, these 3 building blocks, you can use these building blocks to put together in different and interesting ways that makes it really powerful in your application. So those 3 building blocks, this is where we're actually going to have code on the screen. So again, anybody that's in the back that feels like you need to move forward at all, please feel free to do so. The 3 building blocks that we have for our Context API is the context instance itself, the provider, and the consumer. And that's it. And if you can internalize those and understand how those are working together, you can do a ton of different things in your application as we kind of explore these different implementation patterns and strategies. So first, let's talk about the context instance itself. So the context instance itself is just this object that has these really useful properties on it. This is our Context API at work. We create this object by simply defining a variable and setting it equal to the evaluated result of React.createContext. React being our actual React library. So it's just a method on the React library that we use to create this object. And this object has a couple of methods on it, or properties on it. It has a provider property and it has a consumer property. So we create our context object, and then we have access to these 2 other blocks. First, let's talk about the provider. The provider, oh, sorry, you guys are letting me slip. I'm walking too far over. I can see VJ getting mad at me. The provider is simply a JSX component that we can use to pass value into our context instance. And this is an example of just like a basic context instance. So we created the myFirstContext context instance, that object, and then we use the provider property on myFirstContext, which is the object we created. And we wrap it in a JSX tag. And at that point, we could wrap stuff in this JSX tag, essentially saying that anything that's wrapped in this JSX tag, anything below it, we will have access to the value that we give to that context instance. And that'll make more sense as we go through the rest of these. So here, we're taking this provider tag, and we're going to wrap some stuff. And we want anything that we wrap in this provider tag to have access to whatever we pass in here to this value property. This is the big important thing for the provider building block, so to speak. Right here, we're just passing in a string that says some data. So we're saying that anything that we wrap in this provider tag is going to have access to some data via the 3rd building block, which is our consumer. So we have context, we have the provider, and we have the consumer. Can you guys all see back there? Well, the consumer down here at the bottom? Cool. So we have our consumer here. Now our consumer is very similar in the sense that it's used as a JSX tag. It's set up as a JSX tag and it surrounds something. And this JSX tag, this consumer, has to return a function. And this function, under the hood, is automatically passed an argument. And we can set it up as a parameter, whatever we want to call it. For this example, I just call it context value. But automatically, under the hood, the value that we passed in here to our provider is sent to our consumer into this parameter here, which then allows us to do whatever the hell we want to do with whatever value we passed in here. So in this example, I'm just doing something really simple. I don't know if you guys can see that or not. I'm returning a div from this component. And inside this div, I just have a simple sentence that says, I'm the context value, and then I'm rendering the evaluated result of this argument that was passed in here. So when this is rendered to the actual screen onto our DOM, we would see, I'm the context value, some data. And it's as simple as that. If you can grasp these 3 building blocks, you have the context API. Now it's just about how creative you can get with building out the rest of your application. And we'll see some of those popular implementations in just a second. But before we get into that, I just want to get a quick judgment on the room. Thumbs, I don't know if do you guys do thumbs here at Learning Fuse ever? You do? Now you do? Is that what someone said? Thumbs on whether or not we understand so far the 3 basic properties or the 3 basic building blocks of the context API. I'm good, I understand, I'm ready to see the meat and potatoes. I have some clarifications that I can kind of put into a question and actually ask you, Phillip. I have no idea what's going on. I didn't even mean to come to this meetup. I should have stayed home today. Everybody thumbs out on how we feel so far on these 3 building blocks. We have a couple. It's okay to have clarifying questions because I went through this very quickly and some of you are like 40 feet away and I can still hear myself in my left ear. So why don't we start with you, boss? You have a clarifying question?
I think maybe you will get to it later on, but right now it seems to be a missing piece for me that how the value, some data get, how to pass down to context value.
Okay, so your question is kind of like, how does this data actually make it here? Okay, well, if we really wanted to dive deep on it, it's going to take some time. Essentially, the quick and skinny answer to your question is that the context API takes care of that under the hood. Because it's utilizing some different properties behind the scenes on this context object to pass that value down. You'll see some examples on this actually working. We're not going to get too in-depth on how it's working under the hood, though, because it's going to take us way past our kind of time limit. But if you do have more questions on it after this that you want to meet up with me and talk to me about it, we can dig into it a little bit deeper. Okay. I know we had a couple more in the back who, yeah, go ahead. Either of you. You guys are both in the same direction.
So if you put the provider on some parent component, can the consumer have access to it like many levels deep?
So just make sure I understand the question right. So if you take this provider, wrap a parent component, let's just say for sake of ease, you wrap the top component, you wrap app, right? Can you have access to this 1,000 components deep? Yes. Absolutely. That's exactly what we're trying to do with it. Absolutely, yes. Yeah, you in the back, boss?
The ability to put anything we needed to value, but what is this.props.children doing?
Oh, great question. So this.props.children, I kind of come to this a little bit later, and I tend not to hit on it just yet because when you don't have it in context, which is not saying context API, I've been trying to avoid using the word context. Like, have you guys ever tried to explain the keyword this to somebody and you continuously say this? It's a nightmare, right? I don't know how to do it without actually saying the word context, but it's kind of out of context on how to use this at this point because we don't actually have anything to wrap with it and you don't actually see it in play. But essentially what this is doing is you're telling React, if I'm going to explain it in a very crude way, you're telling React that I'm going to use these tags to wrap something. And anything that I wrap in this is how we get the functionality that anything that we wrap in this will have access with the consumer for that value we're passing in. And that'll make a little bit more sense as we see some examples coming up in just a little bit.
This is referring to the provider.
I'm sorry?
This is referring to the provider?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And then what this is basically saying is like any children of the provider could consume what's in the value.
Absolutely. Exactly right. Yep. Yeah, boss, how about you?
To draw some Redux parallels to the provider section. Instead of value, you would have store.
Exactly. And remember how I said that under the hood, Redux functions by using the context API? That's exactly where you see it, where you see the provider being passed in as a store. It's very similar.
And maybe this comes in the meat and potatoes, but we're about
it's catching on. You see that?
We're the like the reducer process, right? So obviously I can pass in whatever data I want, but then how do I, at the consumer level, sort of update the store?
Ah, you're getting ahead of me. What's your name, boss? Billy, you're creeping up there on Kobe. Yeah, no, he's getting the finger guns too. Attaboy. Yeah, no, absolutely. You're kind of stealing the thunder from our central store implementation. So we'll come to that in just a little bit. But you're definitely on the right track. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. How about you, Matt?
So if the consumer is not the children of the provider, do you get an error?
One more time.
If the consumer itself is not a children of the provider, like if the same.
Okay, so you wrap the provider around a component and then try to use a consumer when it's not a direct descendant of the would you get well, you would definitely get an error. I just don't know exactly what it would be. It would probably be something is undefined at a certain point. I'd have to really experiment with it.
Start time or it's going to be when you hit that particular value.
I didn't catch that last part.
So it's gonna be when the app starts, are you gonna get error that time, or it's gonna be when you just try to access the component?
So when the app
When you're building or when you're rendering?
Yeah.
Is that the question? It's a really good question. I've never ran into the issue. I would say try it out. Yeah, I would say honestly, because I don't think I've ever ran into that issue myself, so I'm not sure where it would catch the error. I would have to actually go in and do it in order to figure it out. So I would say experiment with it. It's the best way to kind of figure these things out anyways, is just to experiment with it. Yeah, cool. Good question though. Any other questions before we move on to the real meat and potatoes? Yeah. Yeah.
Value, is that a keyword type deal?
Yeah. Yeah, it has to be value.
Is there anything else you can pass through as well, or just one instance of value that contains it?
No, it would just be that one instance of value, and then you can add anything that you want into value. Cool. Right on. No problem. All right, cool. Let's get into our implementation patterns. So, yeah, that's got some excitement in there. Cool. That's a good sign, right? All right, so this is the part that I kind of struggled with when putting this curriculum together to explain the context API. Because I always hate getting lectures from people or going to workshops or meetups or anything like that that's super heavy into code. Like obviously, everybody wants to see a certain amount of code, but I hate when somebody uses just code to explain a concept. It's really hard to follow, especially when you're 60 feet away and you're staring at code that you've never seen before and you're trying to learn something new. So I also wanted to kind of incorporate more of like a real world example and like kind of a visual on these different implementation patterns. So for the next 3 of our 4 implementation patterns, we're going to use a similar example to kind of see the differences on the implementation strategy. So for our example, I wanted to use something that's very close to my heart, something that I'm very passionate about. And I hope that you guys can relate to it as well. We're going to use the idea of ordering pizza, because pizza is probably by far my favorite food. So I was really excited to come in today and see that there was actually pizza here. And I think it's actually from Domino's, which is my favorite pizza. No, it's not? Is it Pizza Hut? Well, they have the best breadstick, so beggars can't be choosers. So we're going to use the example of me ordering pizza to demonstrate this setup of the context API. So let's kind of break down this silly diagram a little bit and talk about how this relates to code, because we have Domino's, which is my favorite pizza place by all means. It's the best pizza place out there. Anybody that wants to disagree with me, we can talk after to really settle this. But Domino's as my favorite pizza place, and I frequently order pizza from Domino's. I love how VJ is like, oh, I got to get a picture of this setup. Thanks for that, VJ. Yeah, make sure you tag my head down here, though. Yeah, so let's break down how this relates to our code and the context API. So we have Domino's as our representation of our context instance. So remember throughout these examples that we have 3 building blocks for setting up our context system, right? So our first one is our context instance, which is going to be represented by our Domino's restaurant emblem, whatever you want to call it. And every context instance, or Domino's, has its own delivery system or delivery person, aka our context provider, right? And every provider is passed something. It's passed some data, or in our silly example, we're passing our provider a pizza. It's going to ultimately be transported to our consumer, which is hungry Phillip, hungry me, down here ordering pizza. Okay? Is this everybody is resonating with this example very much? I can see everybody laughing at it. And we'll talk about some different strategies to explain this later if you guys got some good ideas. All right, so we have me representing the consumer for this data, right? And since I'm such a valued customer at Domino's, and I order from them so often, even if their delivery person is super busy and there's like 1, 2, or even 3 deliveries ahead of me, that pizza is still coming to me first. They're not going to go through this first, second, and third delivery. These deliveries are representing our intermediary React components that don't need this data, that don't need this pizza. Our provider's not going to go through them not going to prop drill through them. It's going to go directly to me down here. So let's see what this would look like in some actual code. Are you guys good with, you guys can see it from back there still? Cool? All right. So we have our three parts, we have our three parts of our context system, our context API setup, right? Our first part is our context instance itself. So if you guys can see up here, we're setting it up on line 1. I don't know if you can actually see those numbers over there, but we're setting up our Domino's context instance. We're saying Domino's is equal to react.createContext, which is setting up our instance. And then we have our number 2 part, which is our provider. And you can see we're doing that right here. We're saying Domino's.provider, Domino's being our context instance, and we're using the provider property on that object, and we're wrapping it in outer div. And for this example, outer div is our highest component in this application, right? And it kind of goes back to some of the questions before with the this.props.children. We're wrapping this outer div, essentially making available this value here, pizza, the string pizza, making it available to any component that is at this component level or below. So essentially our entire application. So we have another intermediary component that's here that we're not doing anything with, we're not prop drilling through. And then finally we have our bottom component, our inner div component. And in our inner div component, we want to use the value that we gave to our provider, that string pizza. So we do that by using our Domino's.consumer. So we do Domino's.consumer, and we know that from that has to return a function. So that's what we have going on here. We just have this anonymous arrow function. And we know that under the hood, the context API is going to pass this value, pizza, into this parameter here. And then we can use that value however we see fit. So here we're going to return a simple div with the value of Domino's value. So if we were to actually compile this and render this to our DOM, we would see a simple div. And inside that div would be the words pizza. And that's it. It's as simple as that. So that's our most basic setup for the context API, our most basic implementation of it. So let's see if we can get a little bit more creative. Let's see what happens when we try to use 2 providers inside one component. So taking data from 2 different providers and using it inside the same React component. So of course, we're going to bring back our pizza example. But this time we're going to add something to it because I have this really weird problem whenever I want to eat pizza. Because my favorite pizza comes from Domino's, bar none. We've already discussed this. But my favorite breadsticks comes from Pizza Hut. So I always have this really weird situation that whenever I want to eat these 2 items, I have to make 2 separate orders from 2 different restaurants and have them delivered to me. So again, very similarly, we have our context instance, but not just one, but now we have 2 different context instances, right? We have Domino's, and then we have Pizza Hut, each of which has their own delivery system, their own providers, which is our 2 delivery people here. They're both being passed data. You know, this guy's being passed, the provider for Domino's is being passed a pizza, and the provider for Pizza Hut is being passed our breadsticks. And again, because I'm such a valued customer at both of these establishments, they don't care about these other deliveries that are ahead of me. They take that data, they take that food straight to Philip's house, right? Straight to the consumer. So again, let's see how this looks when we actually put it into code. So a little bit more code here because we're dealing with 2 different context instances, but still the same basic premise. We're still only using 3 different pieces to the context API structure. What was that? What's the first piece of our structure? Piece number 1. Who remembers? What is it? That's not piece number 1. The context instance, right? So we have to build our context instances. So on lines 1 and 2, if you can see it, we're building a Domino's instance and we're building a Pizza Hut instance. So that's step number 1. What's step number 2? The provider, exactly. Thank you. Yeah, it's our provider. And as you see, we have to get a little bit more creative with our provider here because we're using 2 of them, but it's still, again, the same basic premise. We have our Domino's provider here being passed the value of pizza, and we're simply nesting our next provider within it. So we nest Pizza Hut.provider, passing it the value of breadsticks. And we're still wrapping myDiv, which in this example, myDiv is like our top component right now for our application. Essentially allowing this data, this values, to be passed to any component thereafter myDiv. So we move down here, and what's our third piece to that context setup? Consumer, exactly. So again, it gets a little bit more complicated because now we're dealing with two of them, but they're still essentially set up the exact same way down here. We have our Domino's.consumer, which is returning a function, and that function is automatically being passed the value from the Domino's provider, which is pizza. And then it immediately returns the Pizza Hut.consumer, which returns a function, and that function automatically gets the Pizza Hut value that was passed in up here, breadsticks. So now, from within this component, we can return and use that data that's being passed through the context instances. So here, we're just rendering out a div that has both pieces of data in it. So on our screen, if we were to render this, we would see a div with the word pizza in it and the word breadsticks in it. So you can see with just knowing those three components, we start to get much more flexible with how we implement it into our applications, which becomes a huge benefit later on. So we're halfway through our implementations. Do we have any questions so far? Let's get thumbs on just these first two implementations, the basic implementation and two providers within one component. We're good to move on to the rest of the meat and potatoes. Have a couple of clarifying questions so far. I'm still lost in figuring out those three basic components to context. How about you, Boston? We have a question right there.
So with the two providers being there,
Yeah.
is that second provider always a child of the first provider?
The second provider being Pizza Hut?
Yeah, so if you use Pizza Hut, and if you're going to use Pizza Hut, say in a different child component of that, does it have to be wrapped inside of Domino's as it's a child of Domino's, or can it be used separately outside of that?
It can be separately outside of that. It all depends on what you're trying to accomplish in your application. For this example, since we're trying to pull in that data into one component, I mean, it could be nested deeper in the application structure as long as it's still a parent of where it's eventually going to be used later on down in the application. That's a really good question, a very good thing to point out. Absolutely.
So it doesn't have to be returned out of the Domino's one in order to be used at all?
Returned out of the Domino's provider.
14.
I can't even see the lines myself. Line 14 here.
Yeah.
So
So if I wanted to use the Pizza Hut
consumer.
consumer,
Mhm.
I don't need to return it out of the Domino's.
If you're going to use it in this example, in regards to the consumers, his question is more, I think, about the providers. In the consumers, yeah, you would have to nest these because you're trying to render out, for this example, a div with both of those things in it, with both of those pieces of value in it. You would need to nest them.
What if I'm just trying to get the Pizza Hut one?
If you're just trying to use the Pizza Hut, then you don't even need to use the Domino's consumer down here. Yeah, you just use the Pizza Hut one. You still have access to it because it's still ultimately a child of where you set up your provider. Yeah. And you got another one back there? Great question. Why you would want to use two different ones? Like, why not just use it in the same provider, right? If you're just using the same data. I haven't seen too many instances, and I haven't actually used it too much, using two providers for one consumer, with the exception of using context instances to pass down styles. Like, for instance, if I have two different styles, like I have a light theme and I have a dark theme, and I'm trying to pass those down independently somehow. And we'll also talk about that when we get to the default value on the next implementation. It's very similar, why you would want to even consider using this implementation. More so just like separating your data in more manageable pieces. Or maybe you have, in one context instance, you're storing all of your data, specifically like data that you want to render to the screen, whereas in one context instance, you want to store all of your styles. So you can use one context instance to style a div, and then use the other context instance to fill that div with specific text or something like that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's no performance hindrances at all with this. Again, it just becomes more so, what are you trying to accomplish? How many different people are really working on this? Is it going to confuse people having it in two different places versus one place? You have complete flexibility with the context API, which is one of the key differences that we're going to talk about when we start comparing this with Redux. Yeah, and then one more in the back.
So if we were using this in a real-world React project situation where you have individual files for each component, do you need to import the provider into the individual components to be able to utilize it?
Great question. Do you need to import the provider? The provider, good question. The provider, no. You do not need to import the provider.
Context or anything else related to it?
You have to import, let's see here. You would have to import the consumer at the very least to utilize the consumer within that component.
Gotcha.
Yeah. But it would still, under the hood, have access through the context object to the provider value. So you would have to import the consumer for this example if you had these separated and modularized into different files. Good question.
You can basically hide it, right? Still like using your components and...
I'm sorry, say it one more time.
You can basically hide it. Like you don't have to use consumer or provider if you just hide it with your components, you know? Like I can have my components say great. Internally it's basically using provider and consumer. Can I just not tell to the user as in the library user that you don't worry about context at all? It's internal to the component.
I'm not really sure I follow the logic of it, just because it sounds a little bit specific. Let's talk afterwards, and we'll talk about the details of it. Yeah, definitely. Was there any more? Sorry, I went an extra slide back. Any more questions before we move on to the other two? We're good? All right, cool. Let's move on to the next couple of implementation patterns. So let's talk about default values. And this is the last one I promised that I'm going to use this example, but we're still going to use pizza as a visual example on how this works. So using something called a default value in the context API just adds another layer of flexibility in our implementation. So again, we have a very similar setup that we did on the very basic implementation, where we have just one context instance, one provider here, our delivery person. This delivery person is being passed this pizza, and then it's delivering it down to our consumer. Again, not having to prop drill through these intermediary components / other deliveries that are ahead of me, right? But at this point, you're probably wondering, like, wait, hold on a second, Philip. There's something here that wasn't here before. Like, you're not going to sneak that sketchy looking salad that's just kind of lingering up there near our context instance through without explaining that. So what is this salad actually doing here? Well, I've set up this context instance, or this context setup, in a slightly different way. I set it up so that for whatever reason, we don't have a delivery person. We don't have a provider, and the provider obviously won't be receiving any type of data or pizza. If we were to just get rid of that altogether, the default value that our context API would send down to our consumer would be this salad, which I know is just an equally amazing treat to be delivered to you as the pizza, but it would default to this salad. So let's see what that would look like in code. So let's break down our 3 points, our 3 basic building blocks for our context API. Number one, what's our first building block for the context API? The context instance, right? So we're building that just like normal. Line 1, const dominoes equals react.create context. Number 2, what's our second building block to our context API? Our provider, right? Well, shit, we don't have a provider, right? It's like, what's the point of that? How are we going to possibly imagine that some data is going to be coming down here to our consumer if we never set up a provider? This is kind of a stupid example, right, Philip? Well, let's take a step past step 2, and we'll come back to that in a second. But what's step 3 of our setup for our context instance? The consumer, right? So we have our consumer, thank God. We set that up. So we have our consumer set up just like normal. Our consumer is returning a function. That function is automatically receiving some sort of value here, right? We have a parameter set up. Hopefully it receives something. And then this myDiv component is rendering a div that has Domino's value being printed in it. Well, but what the hell is going to come in here when we actually render this to our screen? Well, the context API is going to look for that provider, right? And it's going to say, there's no provider. But the context API is smart enough that it knows when it doesn't see a provider anywhere between the context instance and the consumer, it checks this little area right up here. This little area is where we can set up a default value that says, hey, look for my provider, context API. If you don't find it, check the default value for any type of value that's there. Well, that's exactly what the consumer does. It says, hey, give me my value from the provider. Oh, there's nothing there. Check the default value. Hey, there's salad there. Let's pass salad down into the Domino's value here. If that provider was there, if we did put that provider in the right spot like we normally do and surrounded or wrapped my div, it would simply take whatever value we passed to it there. But when it's not there, when there's an absence of the provider, it checks our default value. Cool. Now that takes us through kind of our really flexible implementation patterns. And I just want to pause for a second, take any other questions that we have, because next we're going to try to tackle this big question. Can we mimic or replace the functionality of our Redux store, of our centralized store idea, using the Context API? So real quickly, before we move on to that, does anybody have any questions on like the default value or any other lingering questions that may be kind of hanging out? Yeah.
What would be a real world use for
Yeah. What would be a real, yeah, that's usually the question that we get on this implementation pattern is why? Why would we set it up this way? And the answer is very similar to like the other answer for why would you use two consumers in one component, why would you use two providers inside one component? Why not just combine the providers? It really just comes down to segregating our data in a way that makes the most sense for our application. So in this kind of setup, we can create one context instance. We can wrap a certain part of our application with a provider for that context instance and pass it a value. And then we could use this consumer in a different part of our application that's not a child or a descendant of where we used our original provider. That seems a little bit hard to kind of follow and visualize, but in that way, we're using one context instance, but we have two different sets of data that we can use in different parts of our application. Just depends on how we want to set it up and what would be the best use case for our application. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Anybody else have any questions? Yeah, boss.
I'm wondering, can you use the same context instance to send down different values to two different components?
Can you use, instead of using two providers to one consumer, can you use one provider for two consumers?
Or, so you, using the same context instance, you create two different providers, but to two different components.
Two different providers being passed two different values?
Yeah.
Sure.
Or, yeah.
Actually.
Two different components. Like they're not imperative from each other.
So they're separated, they're not under like the same parent provider component? Yeah. And that's essentially what we can do here with this context instance that how we have it set up here with this default value. Yeah, absolutely. You can separate them so they're not actually under the same provider. Absolutely. Any other questions before we move on to tackle this big centralized store example, which I promise is not going to include pizza or any food of any kind? Oh, yeah, see, I need to figure out an example for how to bring that in. Yeah, we're done with meat and potatoes and pizza. And I didn't realize that. There's a lot of food that's going on in my examples. All right, cool. Let's move on and let's talk about it. So this idea of creating a centralized store with the Context API, super powerful, right? Because essentially what we'd be doing, if we can accomplish this, essentially what we'd be doing is rendering the Redux library useless for us. So can we do it? So we can. to not build it up for you guys too much. And we do it through a couple of different steps. I really need to work on my cliffhangers and my transitions as well for this. We do this with a few different steps, right? Some of them are going to be a little bit new, a little bit different, but ultimately it still boils down to using our three basic components for creating a context instance or a context setup. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to actually create our context. Pretty simple. We've done that a billion times already before. We create a normal context instance. But then we do something a little bit different. We don't just go right ahead and declare a provider. First, we're going to declare a class, a new class. And this class is going to return the context provider. So just stay with me. We're going to show some examples of that. I don't have any fancy, funny images, but we're actually going to see the code for how this would look in just a second. So we create a class, and that class is going to return the context provider. And then we're going to pass values to that provider just like we normally would. So we can do something where we're not just passing a simple string, we pass in something that's a little more interesting. Bless you, I think? You're welcome. So we're going to pass something a little bit more interesting to our value prop, right? Now we're going to pass it an object. And on that object, we can store anything we want, including state, which is what we're going to do in this example. The state for the class that we just created. And we're going to set up state just like we normally would in any other React component. And then we're also going to pass it some methods. We're going to pass it some functions that have the power to change the state in that class. So we're going to do some fancy binding like we normally do, and then we're going to pass that method on that value prop object. Then we're going to take that entire class that we created in step 2, and we're going to wrap it, and we're going to wrap our top level component similar to how we've done in the past with our direct context.provider component. So what does that look like? So for this example, we're going to say that we're building out an application that's a photo gallery, right? And we want to have nothing rendered to our screen at first, but we do want to at some point be able to click a button and send out some sort of AJAX request to an API somewhere, bring in some photos, store those photos in our state, and then render that state, those photos, to our page. That's generally what we're trying to do here with this application. So how would that look? So again, following step 1, we're going to create our context instance, right? So we create gallery context, and that's equal to react.createContext. Simple, easy peasy. Then we're going to create our class. For this example, we're just going to call our class Central Store to be semantic about it, right? So we create a class called Central Store up here on line 3, I think that is. And then we do our normal React stuff. We'll come back to that in just a second. But ultimately, from this class, the Central Store class, we're going to render our gallery context.provider. Remember, gallery context is this context value that we created up here. We're going to return from that class gallery context.provider. And then we're going to put some stuff in there that we'll talk about in just a second. And then this comes back to the question that somebody had right in the beginning, which is, what is this.props.children thing? This is us again using that, telling React that whatever we end up wrapping our central store in, whatever we end up wrapping that around, we're saying that we want all of its children, it and all of its children down our application, to have access to whatever we're passing into this value property. That's what we're doing here on the this.props.children section. So we have the provider set up that we're returning out, and then we're going to pass some stuff into it. So what are we going to pass into it? Well, first of all, we're going to pass our state into it. We're going to spread our state object into that value. So we set up our state up here, and very simple state, we just have a property called images, and it's just set to an empty array right now, because we don't have anything set inside of it at this point. Again, remember, we're going to fetch that data from somewhere else and bring those images in. So we define a function called getPhotos, and then we set up a simple fetch request to an API somewhere that's going to return those pictures, and then we're going to set our state with those images that are returned from that API. And then we simply just bind our this.getPhotos to our state like we normally would in any other React application. And then we take that getPhotos function and we set it on this object that we're putting into the value. And essentially what we're doing here is we're setting up our application so that we will have access to the state of our application and any methods that can change that state at any point, at any level in our application. And then our last step, our final step, is simply taking Central Store, which again was that class that we created up here. We take Central Store and we wrap whatever our top component is. Convention is it's app or whatever we call it, we wrap our top component in that Central Store. And now we have access to everything that's in value throughout our entire application, which means that if we call getPhotos at any point down further in our application, we click a button, whatever kind of event fires, and we run that function, it's going to fire, it's going to send off our fetch request, get that data back, it's going to update state, which is going to hit our diffing algorithm with React, and it's going to re-render all the components that change, which would in turn render all of our photos to our page. So we did it. We set up a centralized store. Yeah, see, we got some people that are excited in the back. See, I was pumped on this. I was like, hell yeah, I hate Redux now, right? No, not necessarily, not necessarily. We'll talk about that in just a second. But essentially, we just did it. We recreated the general functionality of Redux and how we use it normally in our React applications without having to import any other libraries. Remember, all of this stuff is native to React. It's already there, just waiting for you to use it. So, which brings us to that burning question. Is the Context API a replacement for Redux? Now, I'm sure most of you probably knew that you weren't going to get a person that's going to walk in today and tell you, yes, Redux is dead, never use it again. Of course not. Everything has its own place. So the real answer to this question is, it all depends. It all depends. It all depends on what you're trying to accomplish. It depends on your situation. It depends on a few different things. So before we start, wrapping up and taking any final questions that we may have, let's talk about, just high-level overview, some of the key differences that'll kind of allow you to figure out early on whether or not you want to use the Context API or Redux in your applications before you actually start building them. So what are some of the things that should roll through your head when making that decision? So keep in mind, as we compare these two, the Context API and Redux, Context API is flexible. Very flexible, as you've seen. We just ran through 4 different implementations, and that's not even half, that's a fraction of what you can actually do with implementations of the Context API. Whereas Redux is very opinionated. It's very structured on how you have to set it up. You have to have things set up in a very specific way in order to make it work. Now, is that good or bad? It all depends on what you're trying to do. Are you the only one that's working on this application? Is it going to be a small or medium-sized application where you can really easily spin up an entire application with the Context API in a very a light manner because you're not pulling in any other libraries or anything like that? If that's the case, Context API is looking pretty good at this point. Because as you've already seen, we just did everything that Redux basically does with the Context API. Of course, there's some key differences there, like dev tools and things like that. But we've done pretty much everything that we needed to do with the Context API. But do you have a bunch of people working on your application? Do you have a team of 20 engineers working on this huge application on a regular basis? Because having something that's super flexible may not be what you really want in an application like that. Because now at work, when I first started my job where I'm at now, we have tens of thousands of lines of code. But we use a React Redux setup, right? We have React and Redux in our stack. And because I'm experienced in Redux, I was able to go in and say, holy shit, like this is huge. Like how do I even get around? Like my first assignment that I had to do, I was like, I have no idea how to get around in this code base. But I started digging into it, and I know Redux well enough. I was able to say, okay, well, we have our actions here, and we have our these files are here, and I was able to kind of dig and sift through all of these different reducers and things because I knew how Redux operated. And on a large scale, you're still able to pick through and figure out what's happening in what files because you have a very opinionated library to work through. You don't have that with the Context API, so it can be done a lot of different ways, so it could be confusing. The Context API is included in the React library. It makes it a little bit more efficient, a little bit lighter, there's less code to work with, and you don't have to import anything. Whereas the Redux library is an outside library that you have to import. The React Context API is minimal setup. I know one of the key things that I hated when I first started using Redux was all the damn boilerplate you have to set up. Who's with me? Most of us, okay. And everybody else that didn't raise your hand, you're all damn liars. I know you're lying to me right now. That's usually one of the biggest kind of learning curves with Redux is learning how to set up the boilerplate for this. But as you've seen so far, we're all experts now in the Context API, right? Yeah, absolutely. In 45 minutes, we just learned the Context API, and we can set that up really easily. So there's also something to think about there. And then probably one of the next big ones for deciding between the two of these is this version of the Context API is a lot newer. So it has a lot smaller ecosystem around it. And one of the huge benefits of using Redux is that ecosystem. Mainly, the developer tools for Redux are awesome. You have time travel debugging and all kinds of really neat features that allow you to debug your applications much more easily. So also something to take into account when deciding whether or not you want to use Redux or the Context API. So, what other questions do we have?